Okay,
Thank you.
good.
Sorry.
I'm looking forward to this talk with you, and I was wondering what kind of hat I should wear being here right now. Is it the editor of forskningsprosjektet? Is it an innovation researcher, or is it a policymaker? And I thought that right now, what I need, and I think that given that this is also a gathering of policymakers, I'll use the hat of the policymakers, which leads to completely different questions, different from the academic ones. But you are also, well, you refuse to call yourself a policymaker, but you're working at the Italian Research Council, so you know the drill. And I thought that we could do a thought experiment. We are in Norway, and we have research projects with interesting findings. Mm-hmm. And I'm telling right now, in this imaginary scenario, I'm working at the ministry. And I'm going to tell the minister about this project. And the minister is not really in the mood for a lot of numbers and statistics and graphs and so on. He's very busy. He's going to a new meeting somewhere else in 15 minutes. So it's all a matter of what's in it for me. What does this mean for research and innovation policy? I'm coming to the main question afterwards, but I'll start by sorting out something I think that will be confusing for the minister, regardless of how insightful he or she is, right? Mm-hmm. And that is the differences between the different kinds of crises, the different kinds of unexpected happenings. Because when you talked, there was sometimes for me, it's like hard to understand, well, what crisis are you talking about now? Because this project is about COVID, and you have done research on the financial crisis, and we're not talking about Ukraine and different types of crises. What all of these have in common is that they are not really directly technological revolutions. In the sense of the 5 big waves, or you can even talk about smaller revolutions. That's part of these longer trajectories, but it's not really COVID. It's a disease, and it can happen anytime, which it also have throughout history. And the financial crisis obviously it's anchored in technological revolutions, but it's not one per se. So what I was a little bit bewildered by was that the kind of advice we give to the minister will vary, I suspect, greatly, depending on what kind of crisis you're facing. One like the COVID one, or let's say the advent of AI in all industries, right? That's a technological revolution, and while the COVID is shit happens kind of revolution. Could you explain to the minister the difference between the two?
Well, first of all, I know very little about the Norwegian economy. That's the first point. But I'm learning something. And the first thing I'm learning is, for example, that there is a compensation scheme that is not for free. In other words, companies have to pay a price, I don't know which sort of price. Is that reputation? Is administrative? It is an increased control? But anyhow, it seems that companies at a certain point are happy to withdraw for the compensation scheme, and they should not give it for granted. So that's the first question. What does it mean? It means that apparently from the data showing that the compensation scheme goes down and there are variations across the different kinds of firms, as Eric and the colleague from the statistical office have clearly shown, it seems that the scheme is quite well designed, And it's already something. Why? It seems that there is a government which is able to react well to an unforeseen situation. That's my and that should not be given for granted. Governments make mistakes. The larger the government, the more it's difficult to reach precisely and to give to the economic sector what they need and so on. Second, it seems that the largest company in this country is Statoil. Am I wrong?
New name, Equinor.
Sorry?
New name, Equinor, but yeah.
New name. Trademark. A new trademark. It's okay.
You know, oil wasn't good anymore.
Good. It's okay. Fine. But anyhow,
Yeah.
it's a state-owned company, you know, and it's a company which is not working on high-tech. It's not Nokia, as Nokia was in Finland. It's not Ericsson. It's not Volvo. It's a company which is a natural resources company. What does it mean? In this country, compared to the neighbors or similar countries of small size with a high social capability, there is not a leading high-tech company, you know. Despite that, by the way, which possibly was also the company which provided some of the resources which have been invested in the compensation schemes to avoid Morgan bankruptcies and others. So, I mean, after all, of course, you should move out of the oil, but sometimes if you make a comparison across two countries, it's better to have some oil in your pocket than not having it, you know. That's, to put it in a nutshell. But what does it mean? It means that at a certain point, the Norwegian economy, in order to respond to innovation, should do it through a variety of different channels, which is not by having one engine which one way or the other provides resources, information, knowledge, capabilities for everybody, but to do it through several Lilliput firms, more or less Lilliput. If you are in such a position, it becomes crucial to know what are the specific needs of all these companies. You know, in other words, innovation policy sometimes might be much easier in a country in which there is an industrial structure based on a few large, highly innovative corporations, because the government starts to become a subsidiary of the larger corporations rather than to lead the way. And in this sense, it seems to me crucial that you try to identify with a detailed analysis what are the needs of companies which are very different among each other. Because the innovative outcome of the Norwegian economy will rely on the success of a high priority of economic players rather than a few number of economic players. And therefore it seems that it's very important to know these sort of things. I know the minister has become already very impatient.
Yeah, he didn't get his answer. But just a comment to your comment, the minister, because it's a very good one. I would say that Equinor, Statoil, is actually in many ways high-tech, but you know how statistics are. Turnover is too big and the percentage of money spent on R&D is relatively small, but they are extremely advanced. You can't do this on the North Sea without being that. Yeah. But they are grabbing on to a lot of manpower and skilled workers that could be used elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I assume that. I mean, I was impressed by discovering, for example, in Qatar, in the Emirates, in Kuwait, that at a certain point, even companies in raw materials, in oil and gas, were very sophisticated. I was impressed to discover that multinational corporations in these fields, American multinational corporations, had to keep important R&D labs in the host countries, because of course you cannot do research, I don't know, in Texas or in Massachusetts if the oil is in another continent, and therefore, so I assume that even a raw material industry has this important high-tech component which should be explored. My own feeling is that it's more important in gas than in oil, you know, for a variety of product characteristics, but still, in both cases, is very important. So it seems to me that it's crucial to provide to all these companies what they needed, and in this case, I would say that there should be a highly diversified menu of public interventions. There is not one policy which will apply to such a large variety of companies. I think the next step would be to connect the sort of typology which covers also services, and that I think is, it's very important because of course services are more important to understand what are the needs needed for these companies at the one side. They decided to explore better how the Norwegian economy does in comparison with other countries. In other words, I'm convinced that you need to have the diversity and the contribution of a large variety of companies. But it's not enough to know that these companies are innovative in one way or the other. You should also understand to what extent they are innovating in more or less than comparable companies in other countries, you know. That's one point. The second point is to understand if the fields of directions are the right ones, you know. I've cited already the case of Nokia. I'm sure that all of you, you know, the Nokia nightmare is everywhere, you know, in one way or the other. But the problem is not only Nokia, because in some ways there are some countries which are going through dead ends. For example, we know some of the new fields. Artificial intelligence. How are individual countries located in these new fields? To what extent these new fields can be associated to the already accumulated capabilities, you know? And I think that to design an industrial policy and innovative policy in small countries, you need to take into account these two things. One, where the world is going, which are the sectors which are more likely to grow also in the future. And on the other hand, to what extent the accumulated capacities in the country will be able to jump into these sectors. Because you might have a success or you might fail. And therefore you should somehow know in advance if you have got enough capabilities to jump into the new sectors. The minister will like it, I'm not sure. The minister would like a short answer. The short answer would be, shall I put resources on artificial intelligence? I wouldn't be able to say, yes, do that. Because I need to explore before if what the Norwegian capabilities are good to be there. Because artificial intelligence, they say, and there are evidence on, for example, on patent statistics, which is a growing field. That's fine. But it does not necessarily mean that there would be space for a country if it's not good enough. And therefore, you need also to associate the size of your investment in order to understand to what extent you can enter into the field.
But AI is the more generic technology, right? So it will probably affect everything, including oil and gas. It has already. And so wouldn't that be an argument for saying to the minister that, you know, whatever happens, we need ICT, we need AI, we need all of this.
It's okay. How many of you have got a mobile in your pockets?
All of us.
It's okay? Good. All of you have got a mobile, perhaps one or two of you have got two mobiles. It's okay? So that's a very pervasive and general technology, general purpose technology. It's okay? How many of you have got, not a Norwegian, but a European mobile in your pocket? You see? It's not enough to be in a pervasive industry. You need to pervasive industry, that's fine. But you also need to be able to succeed.
Yeah, but that was what I wanted to also ask you about, because one of these policymakers, you know, when you talk to a minister, it's about narratives. Mm-hmm. It's not about statistics, really. It's about the narrative. You have to give them a very, very good story that makes sense to them, right? So it's like, if you have a traditional economist, it would be let the markets rule, or if it was a national innovation system way of thinking, it's the gardener. Make sure that companies are connected with each other and with a knowledge base and all that. Different narratives. But your narrative up here was, and that surprised me a little bit, it was, you put up a slide with Google and Apple, and then you talked about how China was coming up with TikTok and different companies, and then it was the rhetorical question, the narrative, to the minister would be something like, Europe is lagging behind. But is that really true? I mean, do you need a Google to make use of modern ICT or AI? You can use it in all kinds of industries, like Sweden in mining, Norway in oil, Italy, I guess, also in tourism, right? You don't need a Google to be rich, do you?
Well, you are touching a very sensitive issue, of course, and I would say no. You need Google. I don't know the name, but I think you need Google, and we have got a serious problem here, because if the information and communication technology is continuing to be the growing paradigm, to use the terms of our mentors, and to be everywhere, you cannot just use it through regulation, because we have got regulations even at the European level, GDRP, whatever it is, and which makes us crazy, because every time we do something we have to give consensus or not consensus, but anyhow, that's fine, and that's external control, but we don't have any internal control. And in one recent paper, I make the example precisely of this narrative, and I said, could Europe enter into this in industries? And I provided an old example. 1969, I was a kid, some of you were not born yet. Two European countries, France and the United Kingdom, decided that they wanted to enter into what at the time appeared to be the dominant industry, aircraft. And they decided to create Airbus. At the time, Servan Scribner wrote this famous book, The American Challenge. He was a policy advisor to de Gaulle, and in this book he said, if it continues like that, the third power in the world won't be Europe. The third power at the time, China, was non-existent, just, Soviet Union on the one side and the United States on the other side, but would be the American industry in Europe, because that would be the third power. And he exaggerated perhaps the importance of aircraft. Still, two countries decided to join their forces to make a lot of investment, and they did through public enterprises, not in a natural resources company, because again we met before discussing the birth of the oil industry in this country, and in many countries there was the idea that since oil was an important industry, there should have been also national companies, either to produce oil or to distribute oil, as it has happened in my own country with Eni and so on. In that case, they moved what was assumed to be a leading industry. And I think Europe now should do the same. And the fact that China is successfully challenging the American incumbent firms shows that it is possible to do. I don't think that Norway can do it alone. I don't think that not Italy, nor even Germany can do it alone. But I think that the European Union can do it. And that, of course, requires a lot of political decision, as it has happened with Airbus. Airbus is now the leading industry in its sector in the world. It took 50 years to build this capability. 50 years. It has been a process of political discussion. There have been scandals such as Lockheed, in which many Europeans, including European royal families, were accused to take bribes from the American side, and as there were controversies at the World Trade Organization, American retaliation, and so on. At the end, fortunately, we have got Airbus, because otherwise the transport industry will be in the hands of one monopoly, Boeing only, because after that, So I think that now we need to think about something like a European Google, a European Facebook, a European Amazon, and so on.
Let's give some room to the audience. Questions? Sven-Ola?
Thank you for interesting discussions. I'm sorry. Thank you for the interesting discussion. I agree very much on the need for diversity. But being a small country, there is of course room for very little diversity within this country. And if we happen to succeed in some cases, they are very often taken care of by foreigners coming and buying them out. So how can we actually manage to develop new industries that would like to stay on working in a small country like Norway?
Well, I mean, so far you are doing quite well. I mean, the neighbor's grass is always greener. Am I right?
No, but that's how we feel, right?
Yeah, I see. But I mean, so take into account that the country is doing quite well. I mean, from the data you have provided, it's in the German manner to counteract the pandemic through a quite important policy instrument, and most of firms are back in activity. Of course, you know, that applies to every country. And that's what you said before. I totally agree, not to comment about that. But indeed, when you got such a shock, the shock is reinforcing the change. And even if the pandemics didn't have anything to do with ICT, the response was to increase the use, the application, the diffusion of ICTs in all levels of the economy, which, by the way, for somebody of my generation, is a nightmare. Last night, Eric and I had dinner in a Spanish restaurant in which none of the waiters was able to speak Spanish. That's fine. And the only way in which you could order your food was by using the menu electronically, which means that if you are long-sighted, as it happens after a certain age, you can see the menu in a certain levels only. And I mean, so it's a nightmare for me, but apparently is one diffusion of ICTs to other aspects generated by COVID, which didn't go back. So what is the answer? The answer is that at a certain point, I'm sure, the United States will develop, not Europe, will develop mobile phones which are even larger for aging people, you know.
Need one of these.
Yeah, but I mean, does it fit in your pocket? So
no.
So you should also design jackets with larger pockets, which will give a lot of work to Italian tailors.
Well, that's good. We have room for one more question or comment. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
No, not number two. Both of you first. Yeah, and then Mark, you can take over.
Hi, Håkon from NIFU. I wanted to first comment, and I'll lead to a question. You responded to the first question from Per on what we can learn from these crises, if I understood you correctly, with a reference to the oil and gas sector, and obviously that's very different to the crisis. The oil and gas sectors are different to, for instance, the crisis experienced from COVID or from the financial crisis, because the oil and gas industry is still a very profitable industry. So there's currently no crisis there. We can anticipate a crisis, perhaps sometime in the future, but for now, we know that it will be profitable also in Norway for the next 5 years. So then, so one question is, what can we then learn from these other types of crises where we see kind of immediate responses when there is currently no crisis there, or at least experienced? And also then, what is the political scope for supporting some sort of different behavior amongst the firms when there is no kind of experienced crisis at the moment? That's what I was curious about.
Wait a little bit, and then we'll take the last question straight away.
Perhaps we should take another one, because, you know, I mean, this country is a country which has the highest standards in the world in terms of gender equality. So far, we didn't hear the voice of women, so perhaps we should enlarge also to women.
Are you trying to get away from the answer?
No, I will answer everything.
Of course we let the women talk.
Yeah.
But Mark, and then...
Okay,
now you...
Mark, go on. Yeah, I challenge Norwegian women.
Well, I'll make a point that it wasn't going to make at the moment.
To Japanese.
But 40%. Norwegian firms, 40% have to be women, which is a very positive thing. But I was just going to make a particular comment, is that the Norwegian software industry is very strong. And it is very competitive even on an international scale. And if you, even one famous browser, and I can't remember the name offhand, that's Norwegian.
Opera Vivaldi.
Yeah. And it was, Siri actually is originally Norwegian, but it was sold to Apple for millions, if not billions of dollars. But it was a Norwegian firm originally.
Can you can answer the two questions, and
Yeah,
then
it's okay.
any woman
yes,
who wants to take the challenge can do so.
I'm a troublemaker. But
Yeah, you are. But it's a fair point.
Yes, I know. So the oil industry is very profitable, even more with the war, you know. But I mean, we discussed earlier, we don't know for how long it will be profitable. I mean, the problem is the sort of administration behind it. Now, if I compare what's happening in the Arab oil-rich countries and in Norway, I'm not worried about Norway. What they are managing to do with the Qatar oil surplus is to spend a lot of money for a football event and to buy football clubs in the United Kingdom. And that seems clear that there is not a plan behind that, but there is just a random organization of the surplus one way or the other. I assume that the Norwegian Wealth Fund, which is investing everywhere in the world, is better run, and therefore they are somehow using the resources also to plan to the future. Let me say that sometimes, our colleague Charles Edquist got in deep troubles in Sweden when he argued that the Swedish government is overfunding research and development. So basically, he has no longer any invitation by his colleagues for dinner. So I'm not going to risk the same, but I see, for example, I'm not going to risk the same, but I see, for example, that in Norway there is an enormous investment in education, in doctoral courses. We are going to be very close to a situation in which almost 100% of the Norwegian population of the age group in between the 20s and the 30s will have a doctorate, which is a major investment in education financed through the oil resources. Somehow this is good. It's good because in the economy, which, as it was shown, is moving more and more towards a service economy, a creative class, and all these sort of things, you will have the resources to provide software, to provide many other things, and in the field. Let also say that when I was doing my PhD at Sussex, if I got a minute more, but that explains a lot of things. We attended parties. The best party was the American parties, Latin American parties, Mexican party, Argentinian party, Brazilian parties, and so on. I don't remember. I never attended a South Korean party, a Chinese party, any party like that. I remember that all the PhD students in Latin America were studying folklore music, psychoanalysis, arts, and so on. Or the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, and the Chinese students were studying electronical engineering. I'm not surprised that after 40 years, some of these countries took the industrial lead and others did not. you know, because the elites, if the elites study dancing, it's more difficult. They are going to contribute to the well, with all the respect for the dance, they are not contribute to the well. It seems to me that Norway too is doing a lot of investment to finance doctorate courses in fields which will be the growing fields of the future. So I repeat, I think if I got a problem to be worried, it would be much more about Qatar than Norway. And I mean, I don't feel competent enough to give advice to the Norwegian sovereign fund. You know, I mean, that's again, it seems to me good news that they are moving into some growing sectors, and there are capabilities in the growing sectors. And that's the sort of things which need to be very much associated. Let also me say, you know, another thing which is crucial for all European countries, including Norway, and which is highly associated with the demographic trends, you know. Our populations are declining. We are declining, you know. And in order to keep a balance, we need to integrate migrants which come from other regions. It is crucial that these migrants are properly integrated and also trained. If you do that, you will have the human resources to continue to have a society. If you don't do that, it's very likely that the countries will decline. And for example, I got this worry for my own country.
We have run out of time.
Thank you very much.
Made some really challenging and interesting comments. Thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you very much, Per.